Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, today I rise in strong support of my bill, H.J. Res. 61, a resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code, of the rules submitted by the Environmental Protection Agency relating to national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, rubber tire manufacturing. My resolution will repeal this suspect rule that the Biden administration pushed out after the election, but before President Trump's inauguration. This rule was flawed to begin with. It was published on November 29, 2024, after the election of Mr. Trump, but before his administration could take office. Further, as required by the Clean Air Act, EPA performed a risk and technical review specifically on rubber tire plant emissions as recently as 2020. After the risk and technology review, the EPA concluded that the pollutant thresholds and emission regulations already in place were sufficient and protected public health with a, quote, ample margin of safety, end quote. Now, under the Clean Air Act, this should have been the end of it, as the EPA is only required to review and revise the standards on emissions every 8 years. To make matters worse, the EPA basically said the only way to comply is to buy, with the new regulation, is to buy regenerative thermal oxidizers, which are essentially flares that burn off the smokestack exhaust at the specific tire plants. These devices are expensive and likely will not be able to be installed within the 3-year Clean Air Act deadline. It is my understanding that the tire industry estimates that it will cost about $100 million to get the regenerative thermal oxidizers ordered, fabricated, installed, and then about $20 million more per year to operate the devices. While the cost is across several affected plants, these figures are certainly much higher than the EPA's estimates. I'd also like to note, this rule does not affect most of my constituents. I'm sure some of my constituents drive from eastern Henry County to work at the Danville Goodyear plant located in the district of my neighbor, Congressman John McGuire, and that facility would be affected. I had, in rules, was under the assumption, erroneously, that this might affect my Yokohama tire plant today. And I still submit, Madam Speaker, that it could affect them, because what happens at the EPA, if they do it now on the larger producers of tires, et cetera, at some point they're going to look at doing it at the medium-sized producers. And my Yokohama plant, that employs a lot of people in my district, in my hometown of Salem, Virginia, could be affected long term. But currently, it affects Danville. Now, it's about 16 miles from the edge of my district. But in my area, because it's a rural area, lots of people drive more than 16 or 17 or 18 miles, whatever the number is, to get to a good paying job like these facilities have that make tires for the American market. This rule wouldn't be the first time my constituents have seen an environmental rule from the government inflict economic pain on our rural part of Virginia. Several years ago, an EPA rule ended up closing down a plant in a small town. In the end, the Supreme Court struck down the rule just a few weeks after the plant. It was a coal-fired power plant in Glen Lynn, Virginia. And a few weeks after the plant was closed by Appalachian Power, the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA hadn't done it right, and the rule was improper, and it was invalidated by the Supreme Court. But they're not going to come back in and reopen the plant. Those jobs are lost. And the jobs of the people who worked there, who then ate lunch at the local lunch facilities, or who might have bought a car, or who might have bought something else there in the very small town of Glen Lynn, no longer did so. As a result, the people there lost their livelihood, their economic resilience, because of erroneous EPA regulation. The EPA's callous disregard for my people's jobs is not forgotten. And what happened in Glenlyn was, took about a decade, population dropped, and last year they turned in their charter to be a town and are now an unincorporated census area inside of Giles County. And it all started with an EPA regulation that was misguided and improperly done. I submit, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, that this regulation is probably not properly done, but that's for the courts to decide. We can fix it, though, here in Congress with this Congressional Review Act. Some on the other side may say, well, if we repeal this regulation, we're letting tire manufacturers get away with unchecked pollution. Madam Speaker, I say, not so. Not so. EPA's national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants would still exist. All major sources would still have to abide by their Clean Air Act, Title V permits, and various other federal and local controls and regulations. Regardless if Congress were to pass this joint resolution, rubber tire manufacturers will still be subjected to pollution regulations, and the EPA can always come back with an updated hazardous air pollutant standard if they can ever get actual data indicating specific and significant pollution. They don't have that now. I would urge all members to join me in voting in favor of H.J. Res. 61 because it is important for people's jobs and for the principle that let's not just do willy-nilly regulations at the end of an administration in order to pursue something that does not have verifiable data indicating specific and significant pollution. With that, Madam Chair, I reserve the remainder of my time.